Hi everyone, Jason here from spiritualbabies.net. This is the last in our series on Esther. We're covering Esther 9 and 10 today. We've been led through this book by Rabbi Joshua Neely. Thank you very much again for giving us your time today.
Oh, my pleasure. Looking forward to our last installment.
Yeah, it's been really good and interesting, and I'm looking forward to sealing this off. And if you guys at home have any requests of what you'd like us to look at next, please leave them in the comment section or find me on Facebook and send me a message. And if you've enjoyed this, let us know. And as always, there'll be a little question mark that pops up around now that you can go over to Rabbi Neely's page and subscribe to his other videos. There's usually at least 2 a week, and well worth it. Okay, so we are on 9. I'm just going to actually skip back to 8 and start there because it seems that, because there's an and, I know it's meant to be connected. And the tiny bit of Hebrew I know, I can see that there's like a little the vav with the is it dagesh, a little the little dot that tells me that's a connector from the
Right. It actually doesn't it doesn't count as a dagesh when it comes as a vowel.
Oh, very good. Okay. Just saying the word makes me feel more linguistically talented than I am.
But the reason why it is pronounced as an u rather than a v here, just for the grammar nerds out there, is before a collection of Hebrew letters, certain letters, just like in English when we have the word a versus an, where it depends on what the next word is. So too, normally it will be v, but if it is before a bet, a vav, a mem, and a pei, then it will turn into an u, just because linguistically it is more pleasing in natural Hebrew.
That's fabulous. Okay. All right, so the last area of chapter 8 said, "And in every province and in every city, when the king's command and decree arrived, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a feast and a holiday. And many of the people of the land professed to be Jews, for the fear of the Jews had fallen upon them." And this chapter is really going to explain more about that.
And it's going to explain what happened when the day came that was supposed to be Haman's great day of purge against the Jews.
And so on the 13th day of the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, and the king's command and decree were to be executed, the very day on which the enemies of the Jews had expected to get them in their power, the opposite happened, and the Jews got their enemies in their power. Throughout the provinces of Ahasuerus, the Jews mustered in their cities to attack those who sought their hurt, and no one could withstand them, for the fear had fallen upon all the peoples. So we've already mentioned that there was an original declaration to really slaughter all the Jews.
Right.
And then there was a second one that said, if you try to do that, the Jews have free and fair reign to fight back. I feel as I go through this that some of the Jews may have been on the attack, and maybe it's just the way it's translated into English. And but necessarily they mightn't have been a target, but it might just be the way I read it before. So we'll see as we go through. Indeed,
well, we can work on that, right? Because it's going to get bloody here in just a minute, and we're going to want to wrestle with this question. But there's a couple of things to keep in mind as we go through the fighting here. If an army has amassed on your border, and you attack the army before it attacks you, is that wrong?
Yeah, no, I agree. The way that Esther's declaration was worded felt more defensive, but you're right, it's a preemptive strike.
Right. Well, and there's a long holdover of noble chivalrous posturing, especially from Western Europe, that of how a knight is supposed to behave and all of that. And it's lovely, but the Europeans never actually practiced it.
That's true.
And it was, mostly meant for novels, not for reality.
Yeah.
And the morality of being able to attack someone who has clearly postured themselves to attack you is not something that should really be that debatable. If there's a guy standing in front of you and he is menacing you and saying, "I'm going to kill you and your family and take all your stuff," if you punch him first, because you'd rather not have to worry about getting punched and then retaliating, I would hope that no one would find that morally offensive. We are allowed to take people at their face value. If they have come together in such a way that they have, I think the translation was like who were sought their hurt. I mean, literally, these are people who requested to do us evil. Is like more a literal version of how the Hebrew is. If there are people that are publicly going on record saying, yes, I'd like to be part of the pogrom, I would very much like to sign up to where can I kill Jews? I think that when the Jewish people are given permission to fight back and not be afraid of the government troops, that we should not be surprised that they decided not to just all sit calmly in their homes, waiting for them to kick down the door and then fight.
I'm way too much of a pacifist, but I know that had that been the text, had it said, and then when the doors and windows were kicked in, the Jews finally stood up, I'd be annoyed at them for waiting so long. So I know I can't have it both ways. Indeed, all of the officials of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and the king's stewards showed deference to the Jews because of the fear of Mordecai had fallen upon them. So Mordecai at this stage doing particularly well.
Right. I mean, he has taken over Haman's position, and they would not dare have gone against Haman, and now they won't dare go against Mordecai. It's the nature of imperial politics in the ancient world.
For Mordecai was now powerful in the royal palace, and his fame was spreading throughout all the provinces. The man Mordecai was growing ever more powerful. So the Jews struck at their enemies with the sword, slaying and destroying. They wreaked their will upon their enemies, and the use of the word Jews makes it sound kind of more modern.
Yes, and that is one of the things that is special about the Book of Esther, is the consistent use of the term Yehudim when referring to the people. But of course, that's how they would have figured in the Persian Empire. It was more about what ethnicity were they, rather than what nationality.
Right. Okay, so there's a tricky bit coming up. In the fortress Shushan, the Jews killed a total of 500 men. They also killed...
Yeah. Prepare for some Persian names.
Yeah, I'm just going to put a
you can't even blame the Hebrew for this one. This is Persia.
I'm just going to put the cloth over the screen because there's going to be more weather than news in this. They also killed Parshandata, Dalphon, Aspata all over the screen, Porata, Adalia, Aridata, Parmashta, Arisai, Aredai, and Vazata. I'd practiced those. That wasn't my first run, and it was still terrible. The 10 sons of Haman, sons of Hamadata, the foe of the Jews, but they did not lay hands on the spoil. Why not?
Oh, okay. Well, first of all, I need to make sure, because this always comes up whenever I'm teaching religious school.
Okay.
Because whenever we use the phrase, the sons of Haman, a lot of the kids in school, and I think a lot of their parents too, immediately think that these were like, infants. That these were, the little kids running around Haman's house, playing checkers or whatever. And all of a sudden the Jews burst in and slaughter his kids. No, these were full-grown men. These were men who had their own political agenda and were part of the plan and the scheme. As you may remember when we saw from his discussion with his wife, Seresh, I mean, the whole family was involved in this. This was not just Haman being an isolated political actor. This was a family project. So the fact that his sons were caught up in this and therefore were slain during the fight should not be surprising at all. The second half, however, is the one that a lot of people, their eyes just slide past it, and they miss the point. Right? They did not lay hands on the spoils. Why? Because had they done so, it would have looked like what the Jews were doing was exactly what Haman was doing.
Okay.
And this is not Haman's plan just with the roles reversed. This is a strike of self-defense in order to remove all of the lingering leftover people that were plotting against the Jews. Now, notice what didn't happen is the Jews are not destroying everyone from the clan of Haman, that is to say, from his nationality or his ethnicity. They are only attacking those who were actively seeking to harm them. This is not an ethnic retaliation, which is what Haman was doing. This is instead a very focused removal of the malignant forces that had allied themselves to Haman.
Okay. When the number of those slain in the fortress Shushan was reported on that same day to the king said to Queen Esther. So I might have thought at this point that the king might be kind of concerned.
Oh, he is.
But we'll read it. Okay. In the fortress Shushan alone, the Jews have killed a total of 500 men as well as the 10 sons of Haman. What then must they have done in the provinces of the realm? So you get a feel that he's concerned. How many people have died?
Right. If 500 died just in this city, how many more were out there? But we'll go ahead and finish the verse.
But then he says, "What is your wish now? And it shall be granted to you. And what else is your request? It shall be fulfilled." So it kind of feels like, oh, I can't believe that many people died. I would have thought maybe he would have said, "What would you like to do now? I'll think about it." But it's kind of, I don't know, maybe I'm being too open or too understanding, but I felt that the king would have been annoyed at the amount of death.
Well, if you think the king might have been annoyed at the amount of death, why don't you think the king would have objected when Haman first proposed to slaughter many more?
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Right. So there are two ways to read this. One is as you first read it, which is the king is a little bit disturbed, but he goes along with it anyway. Another thing to say is, wow, there were that many people that were working with Haman just here. Right. Yeah. That the conspiracy was that large. He may be, legitimately stunned, thinking, wait a minute, if Haman was going to organize this mob or this pogrom against the Jews across the empire, I kind of thought maybe he'd be using royal decrees or royal forces. But if he had these individuals that were working for him, he had his own army. And that, as a king, would be worrying to realize that there were 500 people in this city alone, and we'll see more, that there were 500 people in this city that were willing to go out and murder on behalf of Haman. That's not the kind of thing a king really likes to find out.
"If it please your majesty," Esther replied, "let the Jews in Shushan be permitted to act tomorrow as they did today," so to defend themselves, "and let Haman's 10 sons be impaled on the stake." This would be the same stake as Haman had already put up?
Probably not the same one, because that at least wasn't the way it was done in the ancient world. Each one would have had their own spike, much like Tower of London.
Would have been a bit more shish kebab if they were all on one, I imagine. But yeah, I know what you mean. The Verdi Impaler kind of scene going on.
Exactly.
Okay. "And the Jews in Shushan mustered again on the 14th day of Adar and slew 300 men in Shushan, but they did not lay hands on the spoil." Again. "The rest of the Jews, those in the king's provinces, likewise mustered and fought for their lives. They disposed of their enemies, killing 75,000 of their foes, but they did not lay hands on the spoils." So this next bit actually was kind of interesting to me. That was on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and they rested on the 14th day and made it a day of feasting and merrymaking. I just did the next bit. "But the Jews in Shushan mustered on both the 13th and 14th days, so rested on the 15th day, making it a day of feasting and merrymaking." So this kind of reminded me a little bit of Jewish holidays in the diaspora as opposed to in Jerusalem. I know it's not...
But reversed.
Yeah, but reversed, right.
But indeed, at this day, Jerusalem is the only city that celebrates that additional day.
And so basically, that extra day in Shushan was just to kind of make sure that no one that was harboring ill will of the first day woke up the next day and tried to finish the job. It gave and also simply because this was Haman's stronghold. This was his power base, and so it shouldn't surprise us that he had more people involved in his conspiracy in the city that he called his home. So it just simply took longer to get them all. And that is why village Jews who live in unwalled towns observe the 14th day of the month of Adar and make it a day of merrymaking and feasting, and as a holiday and an occasion for sending gifts to loved ones. Do we have another example of a holy Jewish holiday that is outside of, well, I suppose it's Hanukkah, outside of the Torah, but it's kind of a man-made holiday that's represented in the text?
A holiday, no. We have fast days, of course, that were established in other parts of the Tanakh as the various events of the Babylonian conquest unfolded. But this is one of the only this is the only Torah outside the Torah holiday that's established in the Tanakh. Hold on, before we move on, I just want to point out something that often gets, again, missed with people when they read through the story, because the part that catches our attention is, of course, the fighting and the slaughter, because we like action movies, and no one sticks around. You fade out when they get to the party. But the 14th is the day that we observe as a holiday, not the 13th. Right? We don't observe our celebration day as the day of the fighting. We observe as our celebration day the day after the fighting, when the fighting was over and we no longer were threatened.
So you're celebrating the celebration as opposed...
Right, we're celebrating the peace. We're not celebrating the war. Mordecai
recorded these events, and he sent dispatches to all the Jews throughout the province of King Ahasuerus, near and far, charging them to observe the 14th and 15th days of Adar every year.
And I should also point out that the halacha officially within Judaism is that the walled city only counts as a walled city if it was a walled city at the time of Joshua's entry into the land of Israel. This is why walled cities in Europe and other places don't count. They had to have been definitely established walled cities that went back to the time of Joshua, which is why Jerusalem is pretty much the only city out there.
Every year, the same days on which the Jews enjoyed relief from their foes, and the same month which had been transformed for them from one of grief and mourning to one of festive joy, they were to observe them as days of feasting and merrymaking, and as an occasion for sending gifts to one another and presents to the poor. Do we know when the tradition of dressing up topsy-turvy came in?
That's not a historical fact that I have off the top of my head. It's definitely, I know it goes back a good long time, because I've read things that are, hundreds and hundreds of years old that talk about that. But I don't know precisely when it came in. The underlying explanation, of course, is that the miracle of Purim was done through the hiddenness of identities. The hiddenness of Mordecai connected to Esther, the hiddenness of Esther as a Jew, the hiddenness of Haman as an enemy. So all of this is wrapped up. And then, of course, the ultimate change of clothes that comes with Mordecai's ascension, when Haman mistakenly gives the advice that the person who the king wishes to honor should be dressed up in the king's clothes. So there are a lot of costume changes in this particular book. And so it is a logical way to help add a little extra something to the celebration.
And it's fun for the kids.
Well, it's fun for all of us. It shouldn't just be for the kids. But notice that there are additional mitzvot here that a lot of people miss. In addition to the rereading of the Megillah, the story of the book that we're actually reading, we also do feasting, and we also send gifts to others, and we also give presents to the poor. Those can do double duty. If a person is not very wealthy themselves, they can give a gift to someone else who is poor and have it do the job at the same time. But most people will send gifts to lots of other people while also giving presents to the poor as well. And the gifts are usually food-based gifts in order that someone can eat and enjoy it on the day of Purim itself.
I didn't know about the gifts. That's the first I've heard of it. It's interesting.
Everyone thinks of Hanukkah as being a gift-giving holiday, but that's very, very new. Purim is the time when we've actually got an idea of gifting.
Okay.
I don't know whether you want to talk, or did we talk about it in another podcast? And feel free to edit this out, obviously, about the idea of drunkenness on Purim.
I think we covered it briefly, and we spoke about the when there's kind of a traditional song where if you can't pronounce,
Blessed is Mordecai and cursed is Haman, right?
Right, yeah. When you muddle those up, then you've drunk enough. But yeah, no. If you've got something to throw in, then throw in it, because this very conceivable that the person listening to this hasn't listened to the other podcast.
So there is an understanding that one should celebrate on Purim in a very festive way, and that included some level of inebriation. There's a Talmudic explanation that one should be as drunk as to not be able to tell the difference between cursed is Mordecai and blessed. Cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordecai. Apparently, I'm drunk. And that has led to a lot of confusion and much discussion by the legal commentators over the last 2,000 years. Some people find that as being the most important part of their Purim celebration, which is a shame because not only is it not the most important part, but also they usually get it wrong. The festive feast that a person is supposed to make and at which one is supposed to drink more than usual is supposed to be the afternoon of Purim, meaning you had the evening Megillah reading the night before, you had the morning Megillah reading that day, and then you go home for your afternoon midday meal, and that's when the drinking is meant to occur.
Oh, okay.
And unfortunately, since Purim is a holiday where driving is absolutely permitted, a lot of people will get drunk at the evening time, and then they will drive home in a very dangerous manner.
Right.
Plus, a lot of people will get drunk in the evening and either not properly hear the Megillah read that night, or not be able to get up in the morning to hear the Megillah read the next day, or do so with a horrific hangover. And so they are really spoiling the holiday and missing on the actual mitzvahs that we are trying to observe.
So it's a possibility that in a few cases people use it as an excuse to drink rather than an excuse to explore the story.
Oh, I wouldn't want to say that, but yes, absolutely.
I did, though. It's okay. I can say it.
Yeah, there are unfortunately many people who get the wrong end of the stick of what the drinking is there to enhance the holiday. It's not the reason for the holiday.
Right. I know at the museum here we've got these beautiful little schnapps bottles. They look kind of like they're in the shape of like violins and oboes, and on the front it says in I think it's in Yiddish actually, and it's just got schnapps at the top, and it's got Purim written underneath in Hebrew. And so there was quite a market for specifically created, and like this must have been going to like 1850, 1900, specifically created alcohol for that feast, which makes sense. I mean, why not? Okay, the Jews accordingly assumed as an obligation that which they had begun to practice, and which Mordecai prescribed for them. For Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the foe of the Jews, had plotted to destroy the Jews, and had cast Pur, that is the lot, with intent to crush and exterminate them. But when Esther came before the king, he commanded, and I hadn't ever come across this word before, promulgation. Thank you, promulgation, which I assume is like proclamation.
Yep.
Of this degree, let the evil plot which he devised against the Jews recoil on his own head. So they impaled him and his sons on the stake. The whole thing has kind of a feel of Passover about it. It feels that it's a very kind of similar story when you've got a group of people who were, I mean, obviously in Egypt there was a much more prolonged period of suffering and death, yeah. But there's definitely that switcheroo where the underdog gets away and the guy who should have all the power suffers at the end.
Yes, absolutely. And that is one of the reasons why this is the final holiday of the year before the first holiday comes around a month later, which is Passover, which is Pesach. Right? So Pesach and Purim are very much two sides of the same coin. And it's also a very powerful counterpoint to Pesach, or not counterpoint, that's the wrong word. It's a very powerful parallel to Pesach, but with enough points changed that we understand as well the progress. There's a feeling sometimes that the cyclical cycle of the year means everything stays the same. But Purim tells us that although we are reliving the same types of challenges that existed in Egypt, the solutions will be will rest more in our hands. And that is why, although there is the element of faith that Mordechai shows of saying, if you don't do this, I'm sure deliverance will come somehow. He still says, do this, rather than sit back and let God do all the plagues and let God part the sea and let God do the manna. This is our obligation to fix. We know that God does not want this to happen, and we are the instrument that will prevent it from happening. And so Purim really stands as a very interesting parallel to Pesach of what happens when the kids grow up and begin to enact the miracles for themselves in order to fulfill God's vision.
God helps those that help themselves.
Very much.
For that reason, these days were named Purim, after Pura, in view then of all the instructions in the said letter and what they had experienced in that matter and what had befallen them. The Jews undertook and irrevocably obliged themselves and their descendants and all who might join them. Ooh. Now that's talking about converts.
It absolutely is.
I'm going to jump in there and say that straight away. To observe these 2 days in the manner prescribed and at the proper time of year. It's interesting for me to read that, it's kind of, you get the story and then you get the bit at the end, the kind of the small print of who this is intended for, who wrote it, how you do it, when you do it. Then Queen Esther, daughter of Abihail, wrote a second letter of Purim for the purpose of confirming with full authority the aforementioned one of Mordechai the Jew. So she kind of undersigns it.
Yes.
Dispatches were sent to all the Jews in the 127 provinces of the realm of Ahasuerus with an ordinance of equity and honesty. These days of Purim shall be observed at their proper time, as Mordechai the Jew, and now Queen Esther, has obliged them to do. And just as they have assumed for themselves and their descendants the obligation of the fasts with their lamentations, and Esther's ordinance validating these observances of Purim was recorded in a scroll, King Ahasuerus imposed...
Before we roll on, I know we're really close, but verse 31 brings back to our forefront what we know from the book of Zechariah, that the Jews had already accepted upon themselves certain annual fasts in commemoration of the various stages of the destruction of Jerusalem under the Babylonians. And Esther was simply reminding us that, the reader would recognize that although this is post-biblical, post-Torah, that there is still a way that the community can obligate itself to new observances that will commemorate or celebrate historical events that have happened since the Torah itself was completed. And now chapter 10.
Right. King Ahasuerus imposed tribute on the mainland and the islands. Now that is kind of taxation.
Yep.
All his mighty and powerful acts and a full account of the greatness to which the king advanced Mordecai are recorded in the annals of the kings of Media and Persia, which I don't think is around. Am I right? I think I looked this up before and it's a lost book.
We definitely don't have a copy ourselves. There are records within Persian archives of their own kind of semi-history, and there are, of course, versions in Greek archives of what they wrote about Persian history. So there is definitely that. And unfortunately, because of the name Mordechai being essentially a cognate of the word Marduk, there's no way to be precise of exactly who Mordechai is in those, because there are many, many people called that name in Persian records.
Right. Okay. For Mordecai the Jew ranked next to King Ahasuerus and was highly regarded by the Jews and popular with the multitude of his brethren. He sought the good of his people and interceded for the welfare of all his kindred. And that is the end of Esther.
It is a beautiful book and a wonderful tale. One thing I can point out is that if you were reading this book in a slightly different format, Haman would be the hero. If we were reading this, for example, as part of like a Greek culture, Haman would be the tragic hero. He was someone who rose to the top of his power, who had it all, and he had a tragic flaw of hubris, of pride, of believing that he deserved everything that he wanted, and he let that tiny little splinter of Mordecai eventually drive him mad until he was brought down. Obviously, we look at it a little differently, but it is a good reminder that the cultural way of telling stories can make a huge difference on how the story is told. And for Jews, we read the story not as a lesson of don't get too prideful or else you won't be able to murder the people you want to murder, but instead of saying, we have to take our welfare into our own hands, and we have to be like Mordecai and be like Esther and act out in order to protect our people. One other thing that just makes this book unique in the Tanakh is this is one of the only books that is set entirely outside the land of Israel after the land of Israel had become our home. And so in some ways, this is also a bit of a template of what will life for the Jews be like when they're not living independently and in their own sovereignty in their own land. Right.
Okay. Thank you very much for giving us your time and your insight going through this book. It's the first time I've broken it down line by line like this. If you guys at home liked it, please give it a thumbs up. Go over to Rabbi Neely's own channel. Give it a like. You can find him on Facebook as well. And let us know what you want next. I'm dying to hear. You can leave it as a comment under here or on the community section of the YouTube page, or you can find me on Facebook. Super easy to find. And let us know, and we'll speak to you and see you all again very soon.